The agenda this week evaluated what a massive new auto sector investment means for the future of electric vehicles and learned why Brampton, Ontario wants a new hospital to go with its new medical school. The agenda's week in review begins examining whether Canada can help wean the world off Russian oil.
One of the worst things that happened to the overall oil industry, and particularly the Canadian industry, is that pipelines move from boring infrastructure projects like highways to these kind of symbolic battlegrounds for the future of the global climate. And obviously, you get a lot of kind of complexity, flattened down into this one particular project. But I mean, what we're seeing right now, interestingly, is that for the first time in almost a full decade, we've seen the Canadian industry actually, at this exact moment, not pipeline constrained. We have very, very small differentials. We haven't needed to rely on rail. It's because we've got the Enbridge Line 3 replacement project that's finally come on stream. We're going to be getting the Trans Mountain expansion project online, hopefully anytime now into 2023, maybe early 2024. But I think when you think about the future and you think about the ability for Canadian industry to grow production and these kind of good friendly barrels kind of continuing to increase market share, the challenge is it's hard to imagine a private entity like TC Energy, what used to be TransCanada, or Enbridge or Kinder Morgan or any of the major pipeline companies. It's hard to imagine them staking a considerable commercial risk on building a new pipeline across the border again. It's just so impossible to achieve. So what we saw with the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline was obviously Ottawa effectively nationalized the pipeline, took it under federal ownership, effectively exercised kind of federal supremacy here and its ability to push through some of the provincial bottlenecks that we were facing, between Alberta and BC, for instance. And I, for better or worse, I wonder if the future of pipeline construction in Canada is going to be one of nationalized projects that are effectively owned, operated by the government until such time that they are done, and then they can be resold to the private sector to manage. And I think that is not going to be a comfortable reality for many people in the industry, but I think that if we get another pipeline after Trans Mountain expansion, at this point right now, I think that's probably the way it's going to look.
Rachel, I'm going to come to you. It's a pipeline that I didn't think we would be talking about. The Keystone. Thought it was done in 2021, and maybe I'm joking here, but is the Keystone really dead forever, or does this change things at all?
Well, never say never. I mean, I think a lot of people in the industry and in Canadian government have a lot more gray hairs as a result of the pipeline. So, I mean, on the one hand, never say never. On the other hand, I do think that the political sort of capital and other things like that, it's not clear to me that there's the political will to sort of, revive that. It's been notable to me. Yes, there have been U.S., in a sense, the very same people in the U.S. who were against killing it in the first place at the beginning of last year have come out and said, well, this could be, sort of the solution. I think kind of focusing in on other issues, other ways of getting this sort of fuel to market, and maybe even other ways of coordination and bilateral relationships in this way might be more fruitful. The issue, though, is I think focusing in on areas of broader, broader longer-term interest. I mean, the sort of issues that are faced on a bilateral basis around not just oil and gas, but also power exports and the like, of course, are politically fraught. And navigating this in a context where, yes, the U.S. wants reliable energy, but also is moving towards much more sort of onshoring in a variety of areas. And so I think there's an element for Canada, even in the energy sector, of sort of picking battles and, particularly on infrastructure projects that are closer to sort of being done or nearer sort of payouts.
In the last sort of 2 minutes that I have, I do want to ask this question, Stacey and Rory. I'll start with Stacey. What are the lessons you hope our leaders are taking away from the war in Ukraine as it pertains to Canadian oil and gas?
I mean, I think that the biggest lesson they should see is that, Russia was able to use their energy resources politically and in a way where they could go into Ukraine. Canada has a role to play here, especially on the LNG side. I mean, we have some of the largest natural gas resources in the world, and we would have the ability to ship LNG to Europe from the east coast of Canada and to Asia from the west coast. Over the last 10 years, the Americans have built probably 10 LNG projects, and over the last 15 years, we'll be lucky to get one done. So if anything, I think Canada contribute resources to market that can stabilize both in Asia and in Europe. So Canada does have a role to play here, but it's going to take a commitment from all levels of government to get our safe, reliable resources to market.
All right, and Rory, what are the lessons our leaders can take away from sort of what's going on when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine when it comes to Canadian oil and gas?
I think the biggest thing to take into consideration here is that this industry moves very slow. We need to be very, very purposeful, very, very thoughtful, and forward-looking in our decisions. You know, I think after oil prices collapsed in 2014, as an example, you know, a lot of people more or less wrote the industry off, that this wasn't something that needed, you know, love and care anymore. It was just something that was going to more or less keep producing until we didn't need it anymore because everything was electrified. And I think that set up a false sense of security about kind of the effort and risks inherent in that energy transition. We are undeniably heading towards a decarbonized net zero future, but the path, you know, the drive along that bridge to transition is going to be fueled in many cases by gasoline and diesel until we've fully displaced those fuels from our mix.
Joanna, pick up the story if you would, because apparently just because we build EVs in this province doesn't mean that Ontarians are flocking to buy them. And in fact, the stats I have seen say we're a little bit behind other jurisdictions when it comes to actually putting our dollars where our feet on the pedal go. If that's not a terrible metaphor, I don't know what is. Anyway, why have we been slow to pick up on the EV purchasing route?
Absolutely. Well, I think Doug Ford's vision for EVs in the province, it's sort of missing half the equation, right? Which is actually helping Ontarians drive electric vehicles. So just because we're building them, that's not necessarily going to translate into higher levels of EV uptake in the province. And it's not going to translate into emission reductions in our, you know, one of our most polluting sectors, the transportation sector, unless and until the Ford government does more to support Ontario drivers to go electric.
And what would that look like in your view?
Well, let's take a look at leading provinces in Canada, BC and Quebec. Right now, we're really seeing a tale of two Canadas when it comes to EVs. In BC and Quebec, 1 in 10 every new cars is electric. You can access provincial rebates to stack on top of the federal one. There's support to install home charging stations, and automakers are required by law to sell more EVs in those provinces. It's no wonder 80% of Canada's EV sales happen in those two provinces, and automakers send all their EV inventory over there. Ontario, on the other hand, is seeing only 3% of new car sales being electric. That is lower than the national average. It's even lower than the Yukon on a per capita basis. It's because we don't have any of these policies in place. And it's also meaning that Ontario drivers are finding it impossible to find an EV to buy. So I think we've got to look to some of those leading provinces and move forward with some similar policies if we really want to unlock the cost saving and emission reduction benefits that these vehicles provide.
Brendan, let me get you back in here because Joanna has accurately laid out the situation as it exists today. But it's actually worse if you go back a few years, and I'll just put a few things on the record here. When Doug Ford became Premier in 2018, he ended the cap-and-trade system. He ripped out all the charging stations that the previous government had begun to build. He took away all the subsidies for purchasing green cars. That was the EV rebate program. And now he is sort of portraying himself as, you know, the greenest Premier around and the guy who's led a revolution of EV in the province of Ontario. You know, there's an old expression, you can't suck and blow at the same time. Do you think they're doing that?
Well, when it comes to some of the consumer incentives, I think they're a zero-sum way to get a few cars on the road today. They don't address the actual problems about the supply, the low supply of EVs in North America. They also don't actually address the problem that EVs cost a lot today. The best way to address this is to invest in manufacturing, to help manufacturers achieve scale and achieve profitability so we can bring the price of EVs down over the long term. I'd also, like to point out that these consumer incentives, whether they're federal, whether in British Columbia, whether they're in Quebec, they're all going to imported vehicles. And so I think there's no denying that they can help get a few vehicles on the road in the short term. In the longer term, investing in manufacturing, investing in Ontario manufacturing in order to help companies achieve scale, help companies achieve profitability is the longer term solution to consumer adoption, among other things.
Greg, can I get your take on that? How do you portray yourself as the greenest guy going, given the history of what they did 3.5 years ago?
Well, I think there's a lot. I think we can throw a lot of blame around, but the reality is that Canadians and Ontarians are not buying electric vehicles because Ontarians and Canadians buy vehicles that are in a $35,000 or $40,000 price range, and the vehicles that the manufacturers are offering right now are at the top end of that. They're $55,000, they're $65,000, they're $80,000, and people look at that and say, "I'm not quite ready yet. I'll wait a little bit." And until the industry rounds itself out so that it meets what's happening, and Joanna can talk to this a little bit more, what's happening in Southeast Asia, what's happening in Europe, where there are more lower cost vehicles, electric vehicles that are available. We're not buying electric vehicles because the electric vehicles that are available and are on offer right now in Canada are not what the market really wants right now, or consumers really want right now.
Okay, I take your point on that, but Joanna, let me hammer this point home one more time on the political end of things, because you raised it in the first place. And that is, we're about to go into an election campaign here in the province of Ontario where the Premier is going to be crowing about what a great environmental/EV record he has, sales up, infrastructure up, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of conveniently ignores what he did for the previous 3 years that he was in power. You're in the environmental movement. How does it look from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I think the fact that Ford has been so reluctant to bring these EV rebates back is not only bad news for Ontario drivers who are missing out on the fuel cost savings that EVs provide, particularly when we're seeing these sky-high gas prices right now. But they're also sending the reluctance is also sending the wrong message to auto and battery makers who are looking to set up shop in the province. I think we need to be focusing on building a domestic market to ensure that there are buyers for the products that those companies are going to be selling and help to justify further investments. Just to go back to Brendan's point, I agree we need to be investing in manufacturing, looking to reach economies of scale, but I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and. We need to focus on the demand side and help consumers afford electric vehicles while they're still seeing higher sticker prices than comparable gas models, which is expected to change in just a few years, as well as supporting manufacturing.
Honestly, I think the any sort of expansion of healthcare capacity in the region of Peel will certainly help to shore up what really presented a significant issue in terms of the foundation of our pandemic response. As Councillor Santos identified, we throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic really saw laid bare the inequities and disparities that have existed in the healthcare system. Again, going back to what Natalie was saying, as long as we're getting that additional capacity to be helpful, it's worth reminding though that healthcare and hospitals are really just the start. As I mentioned as well, one of the other things that we do know as well is that Peel Public Health is the lowest per capita funded health unit in the province of Ontario. And that is again due to the significant population growth that has occurred. And similar to the hospital and healthcare system, we are going to also need additional support as a public health unit in order to both recover from this pandemic response and to be able to really aim for overall health protection and health promotion that will ultimately help to reduce demand and strain on the acute care capacity as well that we do have in our community.
Councillor Santos, what's your understanding of what's being planned?
Yeah, so at the City of Brampton, I'm currently on break from a council meeting where later on we're going to be discussing how we're going to make up for our local share owing to the building of the hospital. And, one of the big challenges, I think, which is also unfair, is the fact that municipalities in particular are expected to come up with 10% of the funds to actually build a hospital. And from my perspective, I think that it's owing to Brampton that the province do a lot more than just expect Brampton to now come up through property taxes 10% of the share to build the hospital. So I think we have a funding issue as well when it comes to the province. We need to make sure that municipalities aren't using the property tax base to pay for hospitals, which are massive infrastructure projects, which quite frankly should be going to Peel Public Health and supporting regional Peel Public Health issues, not building massive infrastructure projects that are the responsibility of the province.
Can you just can you do a fact check with me on that? Is that a new provision requiring municipalities to come up with 10% of the capital cost for hospitals? I wasn't aware of that.
It's an expectation of us, that's for sure. And so we have been going back and forth, Dr. Lowe knows this as well, between the city and the region to come up with $125 million at the local level, whether that's made up from Brampton or from the region. There's this expectation that the local municipalities will fund 10% of it. And so, let's upload those downloads again. The residents, property taxpayers aren't able to afford the massive costs related to, again, a project that's the responsibility of the province.
Natalie, $125 million on property taxpayers. Is that who should be paying for that?
No, and I mean, especially in Brampton, because remember, Brampton, part of the reason why the redevelopment of the Peel Memorial, which was supposed to happen more than a decade ago, hasn't happened, is because Brampton was the experimental site of the first privatized P3 hospital. And I don't want to take away anything from what Rowena said about, kind of racism in public policy, or at least not paying attention to the needs of diverse communities, because there's, you can see Oakville has a new hospital, Vaughan has a new hospital, Brampton has been waiting all along without access to services, with terrible, falling further and further behind. These things shouldn't be political footballs. They shouldn't depend on who you vote for at all, and they don't. I think that's a really dangerous thing to say. But the $125 million to be raised by the community has more than been raised before, because the cost of the first hospital, which was a privatized P3, went through the ceiling. I mean, it was supposed to be $250 million, then $315, then $325. Ultimately, it ended up around $650 million for that hospital. It shrunk in size because the costs escalated so much, and then it ate up the Peel Memorial redevelopment, and the community never got the second hospital. Brampton has more than paid. As I recall, I think Brampton raised something like $250 million for that first hospital. They could have paid for it all with, themselves without ever going to the province. They shouldn't have to pay a cent. And on principle, this policy of 10% local share, it's harder on communities that are poorer. It's bad policy.
Well, let me pick up on that with Dr. Lowe. It is an empirically provable fact that the population of Brampton has a significantly higher percentage of racialized Ontarians than most places in the province, maybe than any other place in the province. Do you think that you can draw a direct line between that fact and the fact that it has received such a disproportionately less amount of funding for its health care?
Well, I don't think you can necessarily draw that direct line, but I think the bigger point that you're making, though, is that a lot of the diversity, a lot of this really complex situation that we have in Brampton and in the region of Peel owes to the fact that there are a lot of inequities and disparities that exist. That's why health equity is a strategic priority for our public health unit here at Peel Public Health. That's why we also recognized throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, that ultimately it wasn't that the pandemic created these inequities or disparities. They're the same health inequities and disparities that we saw even prior to the pandemic. Many of these groups face higher rates of chronic disease, higher rates of mental illness, higher rates of injuries that are all related to the socioeconomic and ethnocultural diversity that we have in our community. And so I think that really speaks to, what I always say is that I think the pandemic really it just uncovered, these inequities and disparities and put them in the spotlight. And how interesting it is that it is a disease that spreads from person to person that reminded us all that we're ultimately all connected, and ultimately this is a community that we do need to come together for.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.